Welcome to Not All Oximeters Perform Alike, evaluating pulse oximetry technology for sleep medicine. Today's webinar is sponsored by Nonin Medical. Nonin is a leader in non-invasive oximetry monitoring in sleep medicine. I'm Aaron Lobestall, Director of Advanced Technology for Research and Development at Nonin Medical. With me today is Don Giroux, Strategic Account Manager. Together, we have over 35 years of experience developing oximetry technology, and we're excited to be here with you today. So let's get right to it.
Sleep medicine professionals treat patients with sleep disorders like obstructive sleep apnea. They also identify parasomnias, insomnia, and hypersomnia. Their work helps other clinicians to better understand patients' immediate symptoms and the risk of long-term adverse health effects. Apnea and hypopnea symptoms include morning headaches, exhaustion, shortness of breath, arrhythmia, dizziness, confusion, memory loss, edema, cyanosis, and polycythemia. Obstructive sleep apnea is also associated with obesity, hypertension, and increased risk of cardiovascular morbidity. Undetected and untreated OSA increases the risk of chronic diseases, neurocognitive and attentional deficits, and even sexual dysfunction. And most of the people who have OSA don't know it. Within the total population, an estimated 4% of men and 2% of women have OSA, but few of them are aware of their condition. Approximately 90% of women and 80% of men with OSA have never had it detected or measured. In other words, millions of people are at increased risk for everything from mood disorders to shorter life expectancy. Why?
A polysomnograph, or PSG, monitors multiple patient parameters during a sleep cycle. It helps clinicians detect conditions associated with poor sleep and recommend further diagnosis or treatment. Polysomnography has drawbacks, though. It requires a patient to sleep in an unfamiliar place, attended by a specially trained clinician, using equipment that is expensive to buy and operate.
One of the technologies used throughout sleep medicine for simple at-home tests to full lab-based polysomnographs is pulse oximetry. Monitoring a patient's blood oxygen saturation allows sleep clinicians to measure the duration and the frequency of hypopneic events. In a 2015 study, researchers found that overnight pulse oximetry could be used to effectively screen patients for OSA. They concluded that it provided satisfactory diagnostic performance in detecting severe OSA patients. What they did not say, and for good reason, was that pulse oximetry should replace the use of polysomnography. It shouldn't. Blood oxygen saturation is both a useful pre-screening method and a valuable parameter to measure in comprehensive sleep studies. That still leaves an important question. As a sleep medicine practitioner, what should you know about SpO2 technology?
Most of you already know about pulse oximetry. This is a refresher for anyone who hasn't read about it recently. Pulse oximetry is a non-invasive method to monitor the amount of oxygen being carried in a patient's arterial blood. It provides a more objective measurement of a patient's condition than observed or reported symptoms. Knowing a patient's blood oxygen saturation level can help care providers make decisions about medical treatment. In fact, some people call it the fifth vital sign.
Several companies make and market pulse oximetry equipment. They all use transmitted light and signal processing to calculate the percentage of SpO2. These figures are common to all manufacturers and models, but several factors affect the performance and the reliability of pulse oximeters, and you should know about them. For example, all pulse oximeters deliver consistent readings for patients with low perfusion. I should say not all pulse oximeters deliver consistent readings for patients with low perfusion or patients who move during the measurements. Dyshemoglobins can affect SpO2 readings as well.
Here's an example. In one study, researchers maintained a constant oxygen saturation level of 97%, monitored by blood gas analysis as a control. Then they tested pulse oximeters to see how closely they matched the reference level. When they introduced patient motion, a leading pulse oximeter gave readings as low as 84%. A patient who is sleeping will move involuntarily. Some pulse oximeters will mistake that motion for desaturation, creating doubt about the value of the patient data collected.
Here's another example of how patient motion can affect pulse oximetry measurements. Shivering is a frequent symptom in patients after procedural anesthesia. In a recent test of patients recovering from anesthesia, researchers took note of failed readings called dropouts and their duration. A pulse oximeter from a leading brand had 17 dropouts during the test period, averaging more than 12 seconds each. Other kinds of interference can also distort or disrupt SpO2 readings. These can range from nail polish to environmental conditions and fluorescent dye. Sleep clinicians are aware of these external factors, but not all of them can be anticipated every time, especially when patients use these pulse oximeters at home.
Here's another example. This graph shows how two leading pulse oximeters provide inaccurate readings at saturations of 90% or less. Tracking desaturations consistently is important in detecting hypopnea or apnea, which makes accuracy at lower saturation levels critical in sleep medicine. That dark horizontal line at an ARMS of 3 indicates the range of accuracy allowed by the FDA. If a patient's actual saturation level is 90%, readings of 87 to 93% are considered acceptable. When a manufacturer makes claims about accuracy, they should calculate accuracy, root mean square, abbreviated as ARMS, to account for precision and bias. The result here shows that pulse oximeters from two leading manufacturers are accurate within less than 4 points of actual saturation, as measured by blood gas analysis. Lower ARMS numbers indicate greater accuracy. The value of 2.9 is not too bad. That also means it could be better.
The difference between non-invasive pulse oximetry values and direct measurement of blood gas analysis is called bias. A few years ago, a prospective cohort study was conducted to assess the bias, the precision, and accuracy of pulse oximeters used in intensive care units. Pulse oximeters from a leading brand were most accurate at the highest saturation levels. Measurement accuracy declined sharply at lower saturations. Again, this becomes more important when your goal is to measure lower saturations reliably.
Another factor that affects the result is sensor matching. The oximeter must support calibration curves for every sensor intended to be used with it. Measurements vary as saturation declines, even with sensors from leading manufacturers.
By now, you're beginning to see the range of quality among pulse oximeter devices. As more clinicians have adopted SpO2 measurement, manufacturers have rushed products to the market. Instead of keeping medical professionals informed about patient status, hastily developed products can contribute to alarm fatigue or miss critical changes in patient conditions. So how do you reduce the risk of pulse oximetry failures when so many things can go wrong? Look for a pulse oximeter technology company with a proven record and with its own intellectual property and production facilities. That will help you avoid most of the suppliers that promise more than they can deliver. An effective and dependable technology vendor should offer all of these things. Finally, evaluate each company on its SpO2 technologies and products. How do they perform? The response will be different from each potential provider. Here are the kinds of answers you'll get from Nanan Medical. We have listed several problems in measuring SpO2: patient conditions, external factors, interference, and equipment failures. Nanan's Pure Sat technology is clinically proven to deliver reliable results even for patients with low perfusion or in the presence of excessive motion. Independent clinical studies have shown over and over that Pure Sat technology provides a consistent measurement despite interference or challenging environments. Also, Nanan products meet or exceed regulatory requirements for durability. They stand up to heavy use day after day. Here are some of the examples.
Think back to the graph that showed calibration curves for different sensors. Nanan Pure Sat signal processing technology uses Nanan Pure Light sensors with virtually 0% contamination. That means you get consistent readings from sensor to sensor and from patient to patient. Here's how that affects average accuracy across different populations of patients. When I said that not too bad also means could be better, this is what I was talking about. This is an aggregate view of measurements across a variety of patients. Pulse oximeters that use Nanan Pure Sat technology have lower bias and lower ARMS than those from other manufacturers. The differences are significant.
As you recall, a leading pulse oximeter had a small bias at high saturation levels. As saturation declined, the bias increased. Now, look at the same conditions from the same test as measured by a Nanan pulse oximeter with Pure Sat technology. Pay special attention to the bias numbers at the lower saturations. In conclusion, the authors wrote that pulse oximeters tend to overestimate arterial oxygen saturation in the ICU, and they often exceed their recommended ARMS range in real-world scenarios.
Remember this? At low saturation ranges, these two brands of pulse oximeter did not meet the accuracy guideline of 2% or less. The only time they are accurate within the standard margins is when levels are above 90%. In other words, they work best with healthy patients. Now, imagine applying a stricter standard for accuracy. Instead of plus or minus 3 points, as the FDA allows, make it plus or minus 2. Even with the greater margins, pulse oximeters from those two brands exceed the range allowed by FDA at lower saturations. This is where Nanan Pure Sat technology makes all the difference. At every saturation level, Nanan pulse oximeters provide accurate measurements users can trust.
Well, what about motion? Think back to the test of patients who experience shivering after procedural anesthesia. A Nanan pulse oximeter used in the same test had fewer than half as many dropouts, and those were less than half as long.
Look at the same concept from another angle. What about when it's not the oximeter that drops out, but the patient's actual SpO2 levels? Some oximeters average their readings over long periods of time, as long as 28 seconds. That's enough time to miss critical desaturation. Nanan pulse oximeters use smart averaging, the blue line, that tracks the raw beat-to-beat value, the dashed orange line, within 1 second. Clinical studies that compare different pulse oximeters use common reference values. This one is based on co-oximetry measurements. Subjects with saturation of 88%, as measured by co-oximetry, also had their SpO2 measured. Here is a graph that shows the results from Nanan and two other brands. If 88% were the threshold for desaturation, that suggests apnea or hypopnea, the non-oximeter would provide the most useful result the most often. Let's look at it another way too. The number of patients identified as experiencing desaturation when the co-oximeter value is 88% varied significantly among the 3 pulse oximeters. Brand 1, represented by the orange line, would have identified 25% of patients as experiencing desaturation. For brand 2, the red line, 32% of patients would be considered desaturated. The non-pulse oximeter, with higher consistency and lower bias, would identify 91% of those patients as experiencing desaturation. You can see the difference this makes in evaluating the needs of sleep medicine patients.
Non-pulse oximeters deliver consistent performance in challenging conditions. They provide reliable measurements for patients with darker skin pigmentation, in the presence of patient motion, and for patients with low perfusion. That means improved workflow, more reliable data, fewer repeat appointments, and greater confidence in the clinical decisions. By now, you have a good idea what Pure Sat Technology is and what it can do for you. If you have any questions, Aaron and I will be happy to answer them now.
Excellent. Thank you both for a wonderful presentation. This is Sri. I am the editor of Sleep Review, and I am here to moderate the audience Q&A. Audience, if you haven't already, please input your questions into the Q&A chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. It's on the bottom left. Also, the slide deck for today's webinar is available for PDF download via the Documents folder on the right corner of your screen. Click on the File folder icon, then scroll to the file with the title pulseoximetry.pdf. Question 1. Do cleaning methods affect readings, such as sandy wipes or alcohol?
Well, cleaning methods should not affect, and I believe that you're probably talking about cleaning the sensors. You just want to be able to follow the manufacturer's recommendations for cleaning, but the accuracy of the pulse oximeter is a result of the quality of the lights that are transmitting that light, the LEDs through the sensor, through the tissue, and as long as there's nothing that is changing, like changing the quality of that sensor, cleaning should have no effect.
Excellent. The next question. Can you go into more detail about how pulse oximeters are calibrated and the specific details of what can go wrong in this process?
Sure. So pulse oximeters are calibrated by taking patients through an induced hypoxia study. So you would take a interested human subject who's consented to this procedure. You would connect essentially an anesthesia machine to them where you can change the amount of oxygen they breathe. And during this procedure, you also have an arterial line in their radial artery. You'll take them through a series of saturation. So you'll start off at room air. You would go down to 90%, 85%, 80%, and so on. All the way down to the lower levels of 70% or so. When you hit each of those stages, you would take a sample of blood from the patient or the subject at the same time that you're taking your pulse oximetry measurement. Then that data is used to develop the calibration models within the particular device, and then subsequently, that calibration model is input into the device, and the patient, a separate set of patients go through that same series of procedures to validate that accuracy you receive.
Excellent, thank you. Please describe the performance of reflective measurements like wrists or forehead versus transmission through finger.
The transmission sensors, the key difference is that you are placing the light source and the photodetector of the sensors side by side instead of when they're on a finger. They're obviously transmitting light through the finger from one side to the other. With reflectance, they are still transmitting light into the tissue. That light is being reflected back into the photodetector. So as Aaron was just explaining with the type of testing that is done to establish the calibration of pulse oximeters, the same type of calibration is done with these different types of sensors. So if when a reflectance type of sensor is developed, that same type of calibration will take place, will be done to assure that we are getting the best results we can from those types of sensors. So yes, different sites can make a difference. Different sensors can make a difference in how they respond and give results. And a manufacturer will do the best that they can to bring all of those different sensors into alignment so that from sensor to sensor, location to location, they will give the most consistent answers or results.
Great. Another attendee would like to know, in the case of pediatric sleep studies, what is the criteria?
I think that would be a question for a clinician. We developed the pulse oximeter. We can follow up with that particular question.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to comment on whether the Nonin 8000S series of pulse oximeters are compatible with the Compumedix Grail amplifier?
There are several adapter cables that have been designed to interface with some of the different sleep study devices from other manufacturers. And those manufacturers like Compumedix or the other ones that are on the market, they're typically passing the pulse oximeter values through into their system and just merging data with the other data that they're collecting. And I don't know specifically about the model that you're referring to. I do know that Nonin has interfaced with Compumedix devices in the past, and we do have ongoing relationships with Compumedix. That would be a specific question that you would want to go to the Compumedix company and just validate that interface with them.
Okay. And somebody else comments. Much of the data in this presentation is from a 2007 research paper. Is there anything more current, or is that the most current information?
Well, there have been several studies that have been done. The one that we took a lot of the data from was a comprehensive study that we were involved in, and it's just that we put a lot of effort into compiling that data and putting it into our presentations. But we could provide some information after this presentation on other studies that have been done in the market. There are some studies that were done not specifically looking at accuracy comparisons, but there were some more recent studies that were published like in 2015 and one even more recently than that looked at the effectiveness of the pulse oximetry of the Nonin technology in one of the manufacturer's systems in terms of its ability to compare favorably with doing full PSG studies. So depending on the type of study you're looking for, if we want to get more information from the person who's eliciting that question, we'd be happy to research it.
Okay, I can certainly pass along their information if you're able to find a later study to send them. Somebody else would like to know, how good is this with AFib, atrial fibrillation?
So what will happen in atrial fibrillation is that there's a period of time where there's no pulse. And the device should read when a pulse is identified.
Yeah, atrial fibrillation is, again, when you think about what this technology is, it's called pulse oximetry, and it's taking readings every time it detects a pulse signal in the finger when you're using a fingertip sensor or wherever that sensor is located. It's taking measurements from a pulse, and a pulse is only going to be generated from a healthy expulsion of blood, a volume of blood from a normal cardiac contraction. And when you have abnormal cardiac rhythms and contractions, sometimes you get, if you were really looking at pulse signals graphically, you would see signals that don't necessarily look as strong or as normal as a normal pulse. And we have algorithms that are built into our technology that are designed to evaluate the shape and the parameters of those pulse signals and to ignore those signals that don't look like a normal pulse. So again, as long as you're measuring pulses and not some interference like motion, you're getting the normal and accurate values. With arrhythmias, as Aaron was mentioning, there might be times when the pulse oximeter is going to detect that this is not a normal signal. We're not going to be measuring this, and as long as that episode takes place, the duration may be long enough to have the oximeter just blank out and not provide readings.
Are non-in SpO2 sensors able to determine heart rate? If so, can you briefly explain how this is done?
Yeah, so the non-in pulse oximeters can measure heart rate. So essentially what you're doing there, like Don just walked us through, is it's detecting whenever the heart expels blood, that results in a pulse that we can see with light. So for every single heartbeat, there's a pulse that we identify. We can say how long was it between pulses and how many pulses occurred during a period of time.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to add on that is when we're using that terminology of heart rate, again, there could be times, there might be situations where the heart is not, the cardiac output is not strong. There could be situations where the peripheral perfusion at the sensor site is not good because the patient may have poor perfusion. And the pulse oximeter is really looking for a high quality pulse signal. And when that pulse signal becomes weak, for either of the reasons I just described, again, the oximeter is going to ignore that particular signal and just move on to the next one. So it may not always correlate to an ECG heart rate. And again, if there's arrhythmias like we were talking about previously, now you're looking at a heart rate that's sort of an abnormal heart rate anyway. So you really have to be careful when you're talking about whether or not a pulse oximeter is going to measure heart rate. Typically, it is, as long as the pulse, which is what we're measuring, is correlating with the actual heart rhythm.
Are there any red flags that clinicians should be aware of that might indicate an inaccurate pulse oximeter reading?
Well, that's the problem, is that just putting a pulse oximeter on a patient without doing any clinical testing with blood gases, you really don't know. And that was really one of the main reasons we wanted to have a presentation like this, is just to alert folks that, in a lab situation, you're really not going to be able to see some of the issues that come up. You put a pulse oximeter on a patient, you assume that the numbers you're getting should be accurate, but that's not necessarily the case. As we saw in one of those slides, different pulse oximeters bias differently. Some bias a little on the high side, some on the low side. And I think the main issue that we'd like to get across is that, in one of the comments that was made in the presentation, is that there are some of the manufacturers whose technology overestimates the SpO2 values. And when you're talking about trying to diagnose sleep patients who would qualify for sleep apnea, if you're overestimating SpO2, the risk there is that you're not picking up the patients that you should be picking up. And other than having these types of clinical comparisons, there's no way that you'd see that. So, best I can answer.
Excellent. Well, that is a wonderful response and a good note to end on. So to finish on time today, I'd like to conclude by saying thank you to our two presenters, our sponsor, and our audience members. Today's webinar is free for attendees, courtesy of sponsorship by Nonin. The webinar was recorded, so you may re-watch for free anytime. The link will be emailed out to all attendees after the event. Feel free to share the link with colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Again, that slide deck is available on the bottom right corner of your screen in the file folder. srpulseoximetry.pdf is the file. Email me at sroy@medcore.com with comments, questions, and future webinar suggestions. And visit us at www.sleepreviewmag.com. Thank you for participating in this Sleep Review webinar.